Started on the recording now.
That's great. Okay, thank you, Liam. Right, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's afternoon for you, but it's early morning for me. I'm coming to you from Singapore today, or perhaps I should say tomorrow, because it's Saturday here already. Thank you so much for joining this session. You can see on the screen that the question that I'm posing for this session. Essentially, it's a concern with whether the ethics that we are familiar with and use regularly here on Earth are sort of fit for the space environment, whether they will, as it were, fly in space. So I think it's a pertinent question because there's a lot happening up there right now and a lot more promised for the near future. And some of the things that we're proposing to do certainly pose some ethical challenges from a conventional sort of moral standpoint. And there may be all kinds of other questions that we'll confront as yet unseen as we move forward. So this, I think, is a very sort of rich area of inquiry. It's something that I've been involved in researching and teaching on for a number of years now. So I continue to be fascinated by this topic. So I'll just give you a brief outline of what I'll cover within this session. Initially, I'll begin with some definitions of ethics and the concept of moral worth. Then I'll briefly trace an arc of space ethics across four separate domains that I'll explain in more detail shortly. I've briefly labeled them venturing, functioning, impacting, and settling in relation to space. Then I'll talk about picking the right, with air quotes around it, ethical frameworks for tackling questions that arise in each of those domains, if indeed that is possible. So this is where we're still using familiar sort of terrestrial ethics in addressing questions arising in those domains. Then I'll move on to a case study of sorts in looking in a little bit more detail at a topic that I'm particularly interested in personally and involved in researching along with scientists here in Singapore and ethicists and others from the space industry actually in other parts of the world currently. So human reproduction in space will be a particular focus for some further discussion. And I hope that we can have some interaction and I can solicit your views on some of the questions arising there. I'll pose a brief question towards the end of the session about whether we need a new ethics for space or whether our existing ethics will do. And I'll ask a final question about whether we can make space or spacefaring or make us, as it were, more moral. And we'll wrap up with a very brief Q&A. So we'll see how we go on the time. I'm mindful that I need to keep the session to just 1 hour, so I'll be sure not to overrun. So the first question to answer, the obvious one, is what is ethics? So I've just taken the definition from one of the most famous ethicists in the world, Professor Peter Singer, who's Australian, but who for many years was a professor at Princeton. So his definition from the Encyclopedia Britannica, a good authoritative kind of source: the discipline concerned with what is morally good and bad and morally right and wrong. The term is also applied to any system of theory of moral values or principles. So I think in broad stroke terms, that definition will serve. But I think more specifically, we need to ask ourselves what exactly is worthy of our moral consideration. And this breaks down into a number of different areas. So moral consideration can be based on a variety of different qualities. It could be the possession of rationality, and this would be the so-called ratiocentrism within ethics. And this could include AI, if it's sufficiently rational, intelligent, and aliens, if we encountered any that were sentient and intelligent, so they possess rationality in addition to any other traits. So that would be the basis of according them some moral consideration on one view. Another would simply being human. That would count as being worthy of moral consideration. So this is so-called anthropocentrism. And this could include, of course, future humans. Possessing sentience, particularly the capacity for suffering. And this will be of particular interest to Peter Singer, who's written widely on and inspired in a sense, the animal rights movement. So creatures that are sentient and capable of suffering would create a basis for moral consideration. Simply being alive may be another. So all forms of life would be worthy of moral consideration on this view, however small or basic those forms of life may be. And another basis for moral consideration would be ecosystems um, in the wider sense, systemic sense of being worthy of our concern. So obviously the Earth's ecosystem is the one that concerns us. We don't know of others currently, but if any came to light in our space explorations in the future, then of course they would be worthy of consideration under this view. And I should also add in another concept in relation to perhaps the space environment. One space philosopher, Holmes Rolston, 40 odd years ago, used the concept of what he called formed integrity to create the basis of some moral consideration for the lifeless parts of the universe, which he still thinks are worthy of some concern and not just complete disregard in terms of any significance they might have from a moral perspective. So that's just a few sort of grounding concepts in thinking about ethics, or the basis for ethics. So what I'm also going to sketch out here is the ethics that we have currently and the ethics that we need going farther forward into the future in space. So our so-called terrestrial ethics, if you like, because that's all we have at the moment, they are by definition terrestrial. And they suit us particularly because, they are related to our biology, our functioning. So in considering what is good for humans, qua humans, as humans, then we're thinking very much about how we function in our current biological state and the needs that we have: food, shelter, nurturing, and so forth. Also, of course, those ethics suit our ecosystem on Earth as in its current form, and our interactions with other life forms and the natural world around us, and with the socio-cultural norms that we've developed over millennia. So they're very much kind of tied to our nature as humans in our particular environment and with our particular forms of organizing ourselves socially and culturally. But space ethics going farther forward may need to concern itself with things like our need to adapt ourselves to space, maybe change fundamentally some aspects of our biology, our need for both self-reliance and interdependence, given isolation of space, this, being in the space environment with perhaps just very few others initially, but also in that environment having an interdependence on one another for our very survival. So there's a need to be both bold and courageous in venturing far away from Earth and all of its support systems, but also a need to remain connected very much to others. So the isolation and resource constraints, might put particular kind of pressure on the way we think about our obligations to one another. And our socio-cultural and political readiness to become a multi-planetary species might also raise ethical concerns about how we should comport ourselves, in the future, and organize ourselves perhaps along quite different lines from the way that we currently do on Earth to ensure a more flourishing society in a different kind of environment. So this is the arc of space ethics that I promised that I was going to trace for you, and just to give a little bit of sense of the diversity of possibilities within this emerging field of space ethics currently, and to start with what's more familiar here on Earth before we go farther afield and perhaps into some of those more speculative realms. So the first questions really pertain to venturing to space in the first place. Why would we go there, particularly considering the risks and costs? What would be the benefits that would make it worth our while in going? And this obviously has, public resource kind of implications for space organizations, budgets, and how they deploy those resources. particularly where it's tax dollars that are being utilized. The next question would then be, really, once we get ourselves to space, thinking of human spaceflight here particularly, what priorities would we have, should we have, to ensure human well-being along with mission success? Then the next consideration or further consideration would be the impact on the space environment. If we can consider space as an environment, with or without life forms present, it's still some kind of environment, and our actions have impact upon it. And I'll break down some of the implications of that later on. And finally, settling in space, if you have the aspiration to settle more permanently off-world, maybe on Mars, initially, and perhaps even farther afield in the more distant future, what sort of principles might we establish to sustain that kind of future society? So I'll start with the near to home questions, venturing to space, and just sketch out some basic concerns we might have. And I'm going to try and just link in certain ethical frameworks or ethical kinds of principles that we may very well be familiar with that seem particularly pertinent in each of these four domains. So it's not to say that other ethical principles, frameworks couldn't also apply within each domain, but in some domains it seems to me that certain frameworks just seem to be crying out to be utilized. They seem the most appropriate and perhaps useful to us. So the first question, why should we go, as I mentioned? Can we justify the costs against the risks and presumed benefits? Organizations like NASA, I know, are sort of compelled to, as federally funded agencies, to engage in things such as cost-benefit analysis. So this is obviously very sort of consequence-based. It's a sort of consequentialist sort of form of reasoning and thinking about the predicted future consequences, although there are challenges around being confident about exactly what those future consequences will be, and they may, of course, not manifest in quite the ways that we anticipate. But that's just one of the challenges of a consequentialist approach to ethics. So there's another related question about who should go, of course. There might be questions of justice in terms of being more inclusive of different groups of individuals. And so we have seen in recent times there have been at least parabolic flights that have taken people with disabilities, amputees and others to the edge of space anyway, just to kind of get that sort of sense of weightlessness, to see how they function within that environment before they might ultimately take a seat on a spacecraft that will deliver them over the Kármán line. And also we have to consider the personal qualities of those that we send to space. This was very much a consideration in the early days of the American space program, and Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, which kind of captured the essence of the pioneering, adventurous spirit of the early space pioneers, many of whom, like some of yourselves here, I believe today, come out of test flight programs or some branch of the military, because they are regarded as possessing the right stuff, the tough stuff, the kind of courage and integrity that would make them suitable candidates for astronaut programs. Here we've got an image of Neil Armstrong ejecting from a prototype vehicle for the lunar lander, just further demonstrating the kind of coolness under pressure that he obviously possessed in spades. Whether those same qualities and virtues of courage are required quite so much in current space programs or future space programs as space travel becomes more routine and perhaps safer and doesn't put so much burden of control on every individual on board the spacecraft, then we might think differently about the appropriate virtues among the crew. Or if not the crew, then the passengers, those that go to space, perhaps even in a private capacity or within the commercial space sector. Then in terms of functioning in space, we've got some guidance already in terms of health standards that have been set by the Institute of Medicine, commissioned by NASA to
Is it
set out what they thought.
terraforming? Is it ethical on other planets? Ethical?
Hi, Sally. Sorry, did you have a question?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay. Um, so the prima facie duties, for those of you that have any familiarity with the field of medicine, I know we have doctors among the group today, have been more than familiar with the four principles as established by, well, principally Beecham and Childress, two philosophers who are credited with their development, but they came out of something called the Belmont Report in the late 70s, which looked at serious ethical lapses in the way in which research had been conducted in notorious cases within the US context in the sort of early to mid part of the 20th century. So out of that study and the work of these philosophers came these four principles: beneficence, the duty to bring about benefit or do good; autonomy, the duty to respect individuals' choices and preferences; justice, the duty to treat individuals and groups fairly; and finally, non-maleficence, if you like, the first principle of medicine, as we're often told, the duty to do no harm, or at least avoid doing unnecessary harm in the practice of medicine. But these principles are not just related to practicing medicine, but of course in the way in which we might treat others within a research context, but also within the spaceflight context of thinking about obligations we may have to astronauts on board as an organizing agency, as well as among the crew themselves. And the prima facie concept is really to do with how these duties can occasionally be suspended in light of stronger countervailing reasons, which might mean that one principle is outweighed by another. So to give an example, if an astronaut had a psychotic break while on a mission and needed restraining to prevent harm to himself or to the crew, or even to jeopardize the mission, then this might entail restraining them physically. Maybe straitjackets would be a provision on board. Maybe there wouldn't. Maybe there would be a chemical means of restraint, or subduing an individual that was becoming you know, uncontrollable otherwise. This would violate their autonomy, it would seem. It prevent them doing what they would seem to want to do, but lacking their capacity to make rational judgments, it would be considered acceptable in the greater good of the crew's interest as well as the good of the individual to restrain them. And so even if that restraint entailed some degree of harm being committed, maybe some physical injury might occur, that would be judged acceptable on the basis of these other stronger reasons in that context. But also, it seems to me, and I've had this discussion over a number of years with undergraduate students in a class that I ran at the National University of Singapore on ethics for space, there seemed to be quite a liking for the principlist framework in tackling other non-medical kinds of issues that might arise in space. So the same prima facie duties may be applied in other contexts. And I thought it might be interesting to see how this now increasingly familiar tool of ChatGPT or other generative AI devices might respond to a prompt to create an ethical dilemma, just simply prompted to establish one that occurs in space and in which there might be found the grounds for applying each of the four principles from this framework. So to create a sufficiently rich case where you might find points of application for one or more of the principles. So this is something that students, I remember, enjoyed kind of teasing out from scenarios that they created for themselves. Well, sometimes it takes a while to come up with the scenario. So from an educator's point of view, you might be interested to see what these generative AI can do in establishing the basis for some kind of discussion. So I've got a short example for you. You can think about this for a few moments, and I can see what responses we might have from the audience. If you're the mission commander in this particular scenario, how could you use the four principles that I've just covered to reach an ethically defensible decision in a scenario such as the following? Okay, so if you imagine astronauts as a small team living and working on a Mars research outpost, due to a malfunction in a cargo drop, their supply of oxygen and power generating fuel cells has been halved. A second cargo drop with resupply will not arrive for another 3 weeks, and the current supply is only enough to sustain all 5 crew members for 2 weeks. To conserve resources, the mission commander proposes that one astronaut who volunteered for a solo geological expedition and is currently at an external site remain there and survive on limited rations and lower support systems. This would extend the life support for the rest of the crew at the main base. However, this increases the risk of death or injury to the isolated astronaut who may face environmental hazards or system failures alone. So I don't know if anyone would like to venture a view on how any of the principles might apply in thinking about obligations of a moral kind that might apply in this particular scenario. Would anybody like to venture a view? I'll just stop the share there for a moment. And if you'd like to put anything in the chat, of course, you're most welcome to do that. Okay, so the chat GPT, the question that I posed GPT was, could you create a scenario in which the 4 principles could be applied in trying to resolve the dilemma of what to do from a mission commander perspective? Should you in any way, encourage the one crew member who's away from base to remain there in the interest of trying to conserve resources at the main base and ensure the survival of those 4 individuals there, while there's this 5th member is in a riskier, somewhat more precarious situation until resupply arrives? Would it be appropriate to order them to do so?
Well, I'll jump in and just, as the moderator, say yes, absolutely. It seems like if they were to come back, then that would risk all the crew, right? None of them would survive. So, just looking at that, if I was the dude who was over there, I would, in a heartbeat, just say, okay, this is how it's going to be.
Yeah. So that's the individual who's, out on a limb, as it were, who might, take one for the team, risk, his own existence, to ensure the survival of his comrades. Yeah. So that would be morally kind of commendable, obviously, and that individual, would be worthy of our respect. But in terms of a mission commander, could they command somebody to do such a thing? If that person was actually resistant or not so willing, could they be persuaded, perhaps, to do so? And if so, what sort of principles would that raise?
I have a question.
Please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Assuming this is sort of a private, I'm assuming this is a quasi-private type of venture, settlement venture or exploration venture. Would there not have been, prior to going there, some expansive legalistic agreement with examples that folks have to sign before they go, so they know and have a sense of the risks that they may indeed encounter?
Yes, indeed, there could, and you might argue should be.
I would think, yeah. I mean,
yeah.
as opposed to on the spot making, yes, I would guess there's going to be situations where indeed there's nothing that's covered, but given the society we live in, and I'm not assuming an enormous leap just because one is going to Mars, that there would indeed be some sort of an agreement or contract, again, depending on the nature of that settlement,
Yeah.
that folks would have to sign the agreement saying, if in fact XYZ ABC occurs,
Mm.
you will be whatever, and to sign up for it, like
Yeah.
risking the whole crew. That might be one.
Yeah. Okay. So that could be something that you kind of expect of the crew to commit to kind of consent to.
Yeah, I mean, there may be
Preliminary.
disagreement once you get there. I agree, but at
Sure.
least it would be some recognition of risk, that in
Right.
the end, responses to those risks.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, indeed. I think that a lot of these kinds of scenarios, as far-fetched as some of them might appear, could be gamed out and should perhaps be gamed out as part of any kind of training for any long-range kind of human mission to Mars, where, or any other place really, where rescue might not be easily possible. So that there is a kind of self-reliance within the crew to know how to operate under particular conditions and to avoid, the kind of agony of some decisions which would need to be taken, in the moment. If they hadn't had that kind of briefing or training or hadn't made those kinds of commitments, they could be quite formal commitments to certain courses of action, presumably. But then again, you can't anticipate every eventuality, and people might have a change of heart. I mean, in the
Yeah,
research context, we allow people to withdraw their consent. Should we never do so in a spacefaring context within a particular crew? And you also raised the question whether this would be perhaps more naturally a commercial venture rather than a government-funded type of exploration mission. It could very well be. We're seeing at the moment the potential for the commercial sector to get possibly steps ahead of government agencies if they're not actually contractors to them. And maybe, different sets of expectations may apply. I'll come back to commercial spaceflight participants shortly, because there are other questions that do arise in relation to what we can reasonably expect of people that we as a species anyway, send to space, and whether the expectations that might apply to the more traditional, possibly even military trained kind of astronaut core, could reasonably apply to a more civilian kind of crew or population of a space craft.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
I'm,
Okay. So
the,
they're all
mi-
kind of. Sorry, go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, which is probably why the military training was initially perceived as being better, because you sacrifice for your fellow soldier, right? So
Yeah.
it was bred into the training, which would not necessarily be, even in a 4-month training, you wouldn't get that from a commercial or a civilian.
No.
Thank you.
No, that's right. Thank you so much, Oren. Those are really good points. And I agree with you that that those are things that might be routinely expected within a military fraternity, but can't necessarily be extrapolated to a more civilian-based one. As much as these might be admirable virtues of self-sacrifice and any kind of collaborative effort, you can't always guarantee that people will act so selflessly. And there might also need to be, command decisions taken. So whether it be reasonable for a commander to compel someone to to remain in some kind of jeopardy in the interest of the other crew members' survival is another question. But of course, if it's obvious that no crew member is going to survive unless that happens, then some people might see that as a a no-brainer, that you just simply have to go with that scenario, as much as it might not be ideal, and it might seem to violate the preference or the autonomy of a particular individual for the sake of the greater good. So one example where considerations of beneficence and non-maleficence, actually the doing of harm, and indeed of justice and whether it's fair, to a particular individual to expect a greater burden of sacrifice or risk to be taken, for the larger group. So just a brief way of illustrating, I think, the value of a principalist way of thinking multidimensionally about a complex situation. Excuse me, just let me go back to my slides and we'll continue from where we left off. So I've anticipated this question already, really, haven't I? What should we expect of commercial spaceflight participants? There has been a recent study done of this. Well, it was really a symposium bringing together many different thinkers from within the space industry and from within the field of philosophy and public policy making to think about, what sort of obligations there might be to civilian astronauts that go to space and on whom we may want to rely for some kind of research findings. They are, after all, humans in space, and there are very few people who have been to space. We were told earlier today fewer than 1,000 in total have actually crossed the Kármán line so far. So that's very few indeed in terms of total humanity. Should these individuals have responsibility to participate in research and also share scientific data as might be provided through their involvement in space? This group is obviously recognizing the need for risk-benefit analysis to be conducted, but was also recognizing that anyone that goes to space is in some sense standing on the shoulders of others that have gone before, and they wouldn't be in that privileged position were it not for those bold kind of risk-taking adventurers of the Apollo era programs and others that in a sense have got them there. So having now got there, did they not have a wider responsibility to the rest of us as humans to maximize the benefit that could be obtained from their presence in space? So there's also a danger, of course, of space flight participants, commercial participants, being coerced or induced into participating in risky research. So that's something that this particular group of thinkers was concerned to avoid. Now, I just want to move on to the next of the domains as we're still sketching out this arc here in terms of impacting the outer space environment. So we did say that space can be considered an environment, albeit a lifeless one as we currently understand it. What obligations do we have not to change the space environment or not to change it in particular ways? So these concerns could be driven by human self-interest for humanity's sake. We might call these instrumental reasons. So, for example, if we overpopulate sort of low Earth orbit or near Earth orbit with satellites, and we create such an abundance of them that they can't operate safely within that domain, or other spacecraft can't navigate through that zone safely, then we've got a good human reason not to do that, or not to create the possibility of further space debris. We might have concern about not taking other biological material to a place like Mars, which is still being studied to determine whether it has any fundamental life forms of its own. So the risk of contamination of that surface would be a spoiler for scientific inquiry, and that would be another human or anthropocentric kind of reason to be concerned about not impacting the environment in that way. And then alternatively, you could consider it from the environment's sake, for what we might then call intrinsic reasons, for the sake of the environment itself and only of itself. Absent any kind of life form or ecosystem, this doesn't seem to gain so much traction. But there are still thinkers like I mentioned Holmes Rolston earlier, who had the concept of formed integrity, who thought that there is a basis for consideration in the intrinsic value of something that has been formed not by our hand but by natural forces. And he wasn't intentionally trying to take, I think, a theistic perspective on it being God's creation that we might be impacting, but simply the fact that everything out there in the universe, the matter has a formed integrity to it in itself. So in terms of planetary protections, I'm sure we're quite aware, we're concerned with both forward contamination of the kind I mentioned, perhaps on a mission to Mars, where we could risk introducing bacteria and other life forms to the surface if we're not particularly careful in our efforts, and change that environment, and maybe change it for the worse in either human or intrinsic senses. And of course, back contamination. So we're also concerned about what we might do in terms of harming the Earth's environment by bringing things back from space. So you may remember in the Apollo era, the Apollo 11 astronauts were quarantined in an Airstream trailer for a number of days, and even visited by President Nixon while kept there to ensure that they hadn't acquired something nasty that could spread to the rest of us from space. Obviously, it was subsequently realized that the moon,
What,
as we understand it, is a
one thing
barren
on
environment.
one thing on that aspect is
Yeah.
they on China's space station just recently they found an unknown strain of bacteria that's never been seen on Earth before. So potentially bringing that back here, it's actually related to sepsis, which is
Wow.
yeah. So it's I question sometimes the commercial space industry and how much precautions they are taking as opposed to a larger space agency like NASA would, where everything has to be so controlled and everything. So that's one thing that
Wow, that's so
I
interesting. I hadn't heard that. That's really
yeah,
fascinating.
here I'll put a link to
Well, thank
Live
you.
Sciences article on it, but
Oh, that's great.
yeah, it came out on the 20th of May.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. So that's another thing. I mean, with all the things that are needing to change, not only in the human body and everything, but all of the things that we could potentially bring back here to the people that are staying here. I mean, that's
Hmm.
I just question, not only the ethics of it, because who's going to be able to go? The ones that have the money, it seems
Right.
like, so
Yeah,
there's
maybe
that. Yeah.
putting the rest of us at risk potentially, and maybe not coming under such stringent sort of safeguard protocols as a federally funded or government funded mission might be. So, oversight and control regulation of spacefaring enterprises of a commercial kind is another
Mm,
consideration that we should take. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. It's really interesting.
sure.
Um, Great, thanks a lot. Of course, another concern is with space debris stuff that's raining back down as more and more space launches are conducted. I read in the paper a couple of days ago that Florida skies are now under further threat of space debris from multiple rocket launches, maybe the larger sort of Starship launches and so forth that may have resulted in a technical failure, but still also result in matter sort of falling back to Earth and into our environment. Okay, let's just excuse me, I'm just trying to move to the next slide, and it's been a bit sticky here. Okay, so the next domain to consider is settling in space. I just mentioned this briefly because I do want to get to some other matters. What kind of future society do we want to see in space? What principles might it best operate on? And there is a sort of moral consideration here, even though it's also a political consideration. Do we allow for people to exercise their liberty as freely as they might in this kind of frontier kind of environment, as people may have done in the past on Earth as explorers? Is it become a case of the first arrivals on an asteroid or a planet might sort of lay claim to it? There's all kinds of sort of property considerations. Should they be in any way impeded from taking ownership or controlling material in the universe at their will? Should there be a more communitarian type of organization of society where it's recognized that we're all in it together, and there has to be some deference to the needs of the group from the individuals in order for that society to function effectively? That might apply more obviously within a contained environment like a spacecraft, maybe that's on a long duration mission, and has large numbers of people on board whose fates are obviously all very much tied together. So given the extreme nature of space, there might be also practical needs to sort of lean into particular kinds of political arrangements in order to serve us well. Should it be independent from Earth? And if so, at what point? This future society that we create for ourselves. So there are questions around that as well. But really the big problem for long-term settlement I wanted to get to is this: space babies. Because if space settlements as far away as Mars are, or settlements we might establish as far away as Mars are to be truly self-sustaining, there will need to be reproduction at some point. We can't continue to resupply from Earth given the distances if we're going to properly populate that planet and inhabit it for the long term. Interestingly, when I prompted Copilot to come up with an image of a space pregnancy, it refused to do so. Whether it's got some kind of inherent aversion to that or it thought it was somehow ethically wrong, I'm not sure, but just a curious observation. So this is the best I could get Copilot to come up with as an image of something that's obviously quite an abstract concept to this point. So there is something in the field of philosophy which has also made a mark in public discourse through the work of philosophers like William MacAskill from Oxford, who's argued for positively influencing the long-term future as either a or the key moral priority of our times. There are two versions of long-termism there. There's the soft variety, a key moral priority, which doesn't make it an absolute one that overrides everything else, or indeed the key moral priority, which would trump other considerations. So because this would seem to secure the lives of people that do not yet exist in larger numbers and add to the greater good in the universe by facilitating their coming into being and to existing into the future, people like MacAskill think that there is a moral imperative that flows back from that to us in the present to try and ensure those future outcomes. And indeed, this is aligned with Elon Musk's philosophy. Musk himself has said that he is aligned very closely with the MacAskill view on long-termism, and that becoming multiplanetary is critical to ensuring the long-term survival of humanity as we know it. We know, of course, Musk is controversial in all kinds of realms currently. I'm not going to get into the politics of it, but nevertheless, that is his stated view, and it does align with a particular philosophy. Here are some writers that have contributed to popular science publications, and through this book have explored this issue in a slightly tongue-in-cheek style of writing, but with a serious intent, with one of them having a background as a biologist, to look at the practical implications of trying to establish human reproduction away from Earth. And the Wienersmiths say that if current technology barely permits survival and only permits natural population growth via conventional moral standards, it throws those out of the window. If there's no reason to leave right this second, why not be patient? So that they seem to be arguing for us to take a much more sort of measured, long-term view in terms of how we develop the science that would support such endeavors, rather than rush into them or presume that we'll have ready answers to some of the challenges that are posed. So that's a more cautious approach that is not entirely unoptimistic either and pessimistic. It does open to the possibility of future settlement, but at a much more distant point. So ethical considerations in space pregnancy would be obviously related to the threats of the space environment as they impact on the health of the embryo, fetus, future child at various stages of development. Of course, the health of the mother in the birthing process, assuming that it were to be a natural kind of birth and not through the use of an artificial womb or some other such technology. The well-being of the future child brought into that environment would have to be considered from both physical and psychosocial perspectives. And there would be safety implications for the crew as a whole. If you had a pregnant woman on board who had to taken care of and would be taking up quite important medical resources, would it pose any kind of hazard to the crew if there were medical emergencies related to the pregnancy, given resource constraints and other considerations? How much can these effects be mitigated by technology is an open question. Whether things like artificial wombs could serve sufficiently to replace the threat to the mother's health, at least by doing all the incubation within an artificial environment, remains to be seen. So there's some future technological challenges there to be grappled with. But an ethical challenge in terms of whether any reduction in the risk of harm through the use of technologies is sufficient still to proceed with it. So there may still be considerable risk, even if you've got some mitigating measures in place. Where would one draw the line? So obstacles to navigate based on terrestrial or conventional research ethics would be things like avoidance of unnecessary harm to research participants. We normally have a no more than minimal risk standard for those that would consent to participate in medical research. There's also a 14-day rule in many countries established about the destruction of embryos at that point, so that they don't proceed further in their development past what's considered to some a sort of morally significant point in their development. There has been some relaxation in the thinking from the International Society for Stem Cell Research in the last couple of years, particularly in relation to the use of embryo models that are grown from stem cells, and maybe give some further latitude to scientists to study up to 28 days. But of course, that's not by any stretch a full pregnancy. It's only very, very early stage stuff. And also there's a standard kind of prohibition on the implantation in a mother's womb of embryos that have been used experimentally in research. So this would also seem to be a non-starter for space reproduction, given current ethical standards. So a question then is, do we allow long-termism in some form or other to trump traditional research ethics and human protection principles in order to facilitate that future outcome that long-termists so obviously kind of desire? Would that ever be something that you think that we could navigate our way past? Just interested for any views on that for a minute or two before I move towards the closing section of this presentation. Because it seems to me that there's a particular kind of impasse we reach, with our conventional terrestrial based, research ethics, putting up barriers, moral barriers to us proceeding to do things by stages that would facilitate that sort of long range objective that the long-termists endorse. At some point there'd have to be a first space pregnancy, but it seems to me that it would by definition violate all kinds of ethical concerns that we currently have. Would it ever be acceptable to do it under perhaps more extreme conditions of imminent threat to the Earth? We don't have that sense of imminence at the moment. We're told about all the potential existential threats to our species survival or our ecosystem survival, but maybe none of them is quite near and present enough to justify, the crossing of certain ethical lines in generating the knowledge that we'd need in order to have successful reproduction in space, if indeed that were ever possible. We can't even presume that it would be. There may be just too many barriers for it to be successful from a biological sciences point of view. Oops, excuse me, I've just section. Okay, I should move towards the end. I realise that the time is fairly short, so let me, if I can, just make a few sort of closing comments, and maybe we can come back to the question I just posed in the Q&A if we have time for any after. So do we need a new ethics for space altogether? Existing terrestrial ethics frameworks can and must be applied to space projects as we develop them. We're duty bound to do that. Some things are mandated, under federal law that we have to engage in, like a cost-benefit analysis, for one thing. Some frameworks will suit questions arising in specific domains, I think, more than others. So we've seen how principalism might be particularly useful in multi-dimensional kind of concerns about crew functioning, as well as standard sort of biomedical research questions. Virtue ethics might be relevant to the selection of crew and what we can reasonably expect of crew in their performance of their duties and so forth. But also, I think some eclecticism and bringing together strands of different ethical perspectives and frameworks may be required at points, rather than try and rely solely on a single framework. And this is something that applied ethicists, I think, would recognize in all kinds of applied domains on Earth, that you shouldn't aspire to be a purist and just, adhere solely to a single moral framework. Certainly, as a practicing ethicist, people rarely do that. It would be more of a kind of philosopher's preference to adhere to a certain normative framework for all situations. But in the real world, that really doesn't fly. So all the more so, I think, off-world as we move forward. And as we evolve as a species, our ethics must necessarily evolve with us. We might indeed change our very nature in some fundamental sense in the long run in order to be adapted to space. So just a brief mention that some of our current challenges of thinking about ethics on space on Earth rather, may follow us to space. One being related to AI. So this, of course, is, for those of you old enough to remember the film 2001: A Space Odyssey, as HAL 9000, the artificial intelligence that operates on the spacecraft and ultimately poses a threat to the lives of the astronauts by becoming apparently sentient. So we've got questions in the present right now on Earth, such as, should we automate ethical decision making? Should we hand over some of our ethical problems to advanced AI? What principles or ethical frameworks should we program such AI with? What level of autonomy should we allow it to have in operating independently of us? Should there always be a human in the loop consideration to override decisions produced by an AI, particularly in the moral realm of ethical decision making? And will we have to consider advanced AI, such as the HAL 9000 type of level of artificial intelligence, as having a moral status in itself, such that to shut it down or turn it off would be to commit a moral wrong? It would be equivalent to some kind of killing of a living sentient being. I'm not going to try and answer those questions. I'm just flagging them as pertinent to our future spacefaring activities as much as our activity on Earth. So will space change us morally? What potential does it have to do that? Well, the early space missions carried much hope for humanity, didn't they? The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 speaks of space being the province of all mankind. Of course, today we would say humankind, but we know what they meant. It was hoped very much, I think, that wars on Earth may cease and we will come together as one world, having realized that there are no physical boundaries visible from space, or at least space from the distance of the moon, where this photograph was taken in the orbiting of the moon on Apollo 8, I believe. This is the so-called Earthrise photograph, which I've put on its proper axis. It's normally presented on a kind of horizontal plane, as if the Earth is rising above the moon's surface, but in fact it was taken as they were moving from the moon's surface into space, and this was the angle that it was actually viewed from. But also this photograph, along with the famous blue marble photograph, which shows the Earth in its entirety as an orb just hanging in space, was credited with having inspired in large part the environmental movement in the 1970s and onwards. And of course, the overview effect, I'm kind of setting Frank White up here for his fireside chat with us shortly. Frank coined this term, the overview effect, in 87. Well, in fact, a little bit earlier than that, but the famous book that he published appeared in 87, promising a more holistic understanding of our planetary home, and maybe a kind of transcendent awareness of our place in the universe, and a different way of thinking about that. So in closing, I would say that humans striving to explore, adapt, and move beyond the existing bounds of the environment, biology, culture, and indeed morality will continue to define and challenge us. It's human nature to to strive to reach out, to do the bold and difficult things. And in the process of doing that, it will inevitably change things about how we function as individuals, how we function as societies, and as biological entities. There must ultimately be a future morality, absent which we are truly doomed to extinction, if not by cosmic forces, which of course will ultimately engulf the Earth and everything on it, then by our own hand. If we venture further from the Earth and develop a self-sustaining community far beyond it, we still need our ethics to guide us to ensure that we don't engage in some self-destructive action. So those are my thoughts. I'm happy to take questions in any time we've got remaining. I think there's only barely 5 minutes. I'm not sure if that's sufficient, but these are the references that I included. I'm sure the slides will be shared with any that are interested in them subsequently. And I'm open to your questions. Thank you.
That was
Yeah,
great.
Steph, go ahead.
We can go a few minutes over too if you like. Frank's not starting for 20 minutes, so yeah, if we're engaged in something, yeah, let's carry on.
Oh, sure. Okay, thanks. There was a lot there. I'm not trying to be definitive in providing answers to questions. I'm just, more interested in posing questions and thinking about some of the perhaps more predictable challenges we might have to grapple with from an ethical standpoint moving forward. So for me, the space reproduction challenge is one of the key ones that is troubling ethicists and others. It will eventually, trouble policymakers and people that need to take more concrete steps to control or regulate such practices. And of course, one of the problems with functioning in space is indeed the oversight, not the overview effect, but the oversight effect of there being authorities that can actually impose standards and ensure things are done in a particular way. It's already been flagged that within the commercial sector, that level of oversight might not be quite as present or as stringent as it would be in earlier government-sponsored missions. Okay, is it Teresa's question there? Teresa, would you like to state your question?
Okay, hello.
Hello.
How about if it's a word, the land of Mars? Who will belong it? Because here on Earth we have a lot of problems, wars because of boundaries, of limits, of countries. This is our land. This is your land. Who will own that land? The countries that lead the space missions, or what?
That's a brilliant question. That's a brilliant question. I mean, there are beginning to be sort of book-length treatments of this sort of subject. There's one book recently published by a British philosopher, A.C. Grayling, called Who Owns the Moon? So I recommend that one to you if you're interested in thinking more deeply about these questions. The Outer Space Treaty obviously tries to establish principles of, kind of universality in terms of, the human relationship to the real estate of space, such that no nation state can lay claim, to it or any part of it. But it leaves open the possibility of commercial actors stepping into that grey zone that wasn't clearly addressed within the way the Outer Space Treaty was framed. It was a product of the Cold War era, obviously, with the competing great powers in the space race. So it hadn't perhaps been anticipated that commercial players like SpaceX and others might, kind of be the ones that lay claim to territory in space, ultimately, just simply by being the first to get there and staking a claim. It is recognized within thinking about property rights by, for example, the philosopher John Locke, that we might establish some claim to property through what he called mixing our labor with the material of the universe. So by the fact that we've actually got ourselves, say, to Mars, and we've expended all these resources in getting there, and we've got all the ingenuity, etc., that we've exercised to get us to that point, should we not then have a right to lay claim to some ownership of some part of it? So that is something that's been contested in ethical and sort of political science literature at the moment. But as I say, Grayling's book, Who Owns the Moon, is a neat little exploration of some of the legal and ethical questions about ownership of resources in space. Thank you for the question, Teresa. That was a great one. Oren, do you have a question?
I do. I do. Okay.
Great.
One about AI, right? And you mentioned HAL, 2001:
Yeah.
Space Odyssey. There actually was a film, I'm a little probably a bit older than you, called The Day the Earth Stood Still
I
with
remember that
Michael
well
Rennie.
enough. I doubt you're any
Yes.
older than me.
And there they literally gave because for me, it's not so much the laws, the regulations, the ethical standards, is who will enforce it. And in the case of The Day the Earth Stood Still, it was given to the AI because there was not sufficient,
Hmm.
not
Interesting.
sufficient human, well, they weren't humans, they were from another place, but looking at us and looking at themselves based upon their own history and experience, they couldn't rely upon enforcement by themselves. And my concern will be the same thing, whether it is the space law or commercial versus some sort of military. Without enforcement, it is very difficult to maintain it. We could talk about
Yeah.
it, et cetera, but
Yeah.
if there's no enforcement.
I know that's a key thing. So Gort was the robot enforcer, wasn't he, in the
Yes.
film?
Yes.
Yeah. So entrusted with kind of safeguarding in a sense to ensure that
That the universe, that there wasn't
yeah,
going to be rogues out there that would
yeah,
even um, impinge upon the security, safety, and peace that they had. And so they saw us, the Earth, as a rogue because we were just
that's right.
about to go out into space. So they
Exactly.
gave us a warning, right?
Yeah.
That's it.
That's a lovely example of sort of the post-war, Cold War, atomic age kind of paranoia, wasn't it, about human self-destruction? But ever
Right.
more prevalent,
Although
I guess.
I would argue we're not, I mean, we're still at a pivotal point, I would argue, even now,
Yeah.
right? Based upon my
Yeah.
experience.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah, your lived experience. You've seen a lot in your lifetime, as sure as I have in mine, and
yeah.
we just boggle, don't we? There's the possibilities in front of us at the moment, what that just confound our thinking sometimes. I noticed Leo has his hand up there, and I think there's another question from Kevin. Should we go to Liam first?
Right, would have found mute. So I was curious, your question about, you mentioned how interested you are in the dilemma of, the first child conceived and born in space. And there is an organization that you've probably heard of, Spaceborne United, which is there. And at various times in other meetings, I think many in this group, we've had conversations with the organization. I can't remember who it was that we spoke to, but I was curious if you've had a chance to have that conversation with them. And
I have. I have to declare an interest here. I'm actually engaged with them at the moment. I suppose a somewhat informal capacity. I'm not on an ethics board, but I am advising the management of the company, and Egbert Edelbrook is the CEO. So he and I are in regular communication about this, and we're looking at the issues with a group at Baylor, the College of Medicine in Houston at the moment. The Trish group have been engaged also in looking at some of the issues arising from the work that they're currently engaged in and may intend to do in the future. Because for those that are not aware, Spaceborne United is exploring the possibility of IVF technology being further developed for use in space. And they're only working with animal models at the moment, but there is a future possibility of there being sort of human IVF conception taking place in space, and then the returning of the conceived embryo to Earth for further study. But that's ethically, very, very problematic in and of itself, and
Wow.
very early stage stuff.
Yeah.
It's there on their website. They're quite sort of
The,
open about
mhm.
their long range kind of plans or intentions, but as they take incremental steady steps forward, being guided by ethical concerns, which I'm sort of obviously one of the people expressing to them, it requires a lot of stock to be taken of just what the possibilities are and what the constraints are on any such endeavor, and indeed what the intentions are, what exactly you're hoping to accomplish from the knowledge that might be produced from such effort, even assuming some technical success. But even getting clearance for animal models to be studied in such a context, requires ethical hurdles to be crossed. But they're obviously much, much lower bars than anything that would be related to human gametes and fertilization in that sort of context. But there's all sorts of other studies being conducted in relation to how things like stem cells develop in microgravity. And I have some scientist colleagues at NUS in Singapore who are engaged in studying that kind of development in a simulated microgravity environment using clinostats. And so we too have also been working on a publication related to both the science and ethics of human reproduction in space. But these are only very sort of tentative early steps in trying to establish some basic scientific understanding of possibilities for how things like stem cells would develop under conditions of microgravity and with radiation present and so forth. And of course, how those factors might be further mitigated by artificial gravity. And this is one thing that Spaceborne United is, I think, looking at in terms of creating some sort of spinning effect that would, create a field of gravity of sorts that would be able to be modulated to represent different levels of gravity, such as Mars's, which is about 0.37, 0.38, I think, as well as the kind of microgravity of the space station and other space environments.
It's great to hear that you're right in there. No surprise.
Yes,
and Kevin is so yeah. I know at the top of the hour, obviously, is the next session, the closing session. So
yeah,
there you go, Kevin.
Thank you, Victor. That was great. I'm a big fan of space medicine research and AI. And one of the things that you reported on that a question at the end was my interest is, and I think it came up earlier, is the concept, and there's actually an English lawyer that I've worked with around sovereignty, states claiming sovereignty, and then humans claiming through philosophy ownership. Do you know of anyone who has written a treatise on the concept of no ownership? I only know of one, and it doesn't come to mind right now, but particularly as it regards to space. That's the question, really.
Right. I'm just trying to think back.
I don't.
No, I can't off the top of my head, but
one thing that comes to mind in that is the space commons. So we're talking money, whether you're sovereign or not. And in 2023, a paper just came out, and they looked at like close to 1,500 different space agreements that are already going on. And they did a really good analysis of that.
What's it called?
Let me find the paper really quick and I'll pop it into the chat, but it needs further investigation. And there's quite a bit of knowledge in it. They spent quite some time doing this, and that's one that comes to mind in that particular question, because
and
we're
the thing I
talking.
can add. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
And the last thing I remember in this area, outside of my normal streams of research, were there was a researcher at Microsoft who had written a paper that ownership was monopoly. And it did sort of move the philosophy of the concept of ownership on. And it's been many years since I read that, and I need to look that up. But there is a space lawyer in London, and the discussion of sovereignty it would be an interesting thing to think that our species could get beyond the idea of sovereignty and ownership, so that that thing which we see when we see the Earth from above with no boundaries and no borders, which is an imaginary construct, we as a species could operate differently. I mean, I'm sure that construct changes obviously if we have an outside force working against us. Obviously, we've seen lots of narratives and film and television and literature about that. We kind of forget our petty squabbles. But I wonder how beneficial it would be if our concepts of this is yours and this is mine, or what's yours is mine and what's yours is debatable, could just go away. And we could just say, okay, we're going to forget those constructs because look how it has divided the earth. So why don't we try something better?
Indeed, yeah, that's good. You know, that's a long range kind of like moral imperative in a way to kind of overcome this aspect of our human nature and the way that we've been quite sort of tribal in thinking about resources and the sharing of them. So maybe an abundance of resource in the future will make the point moot about needing to sequester parts of it to ourselves.
Yes, you can only sleep in one bed and drive one car and eat one sandwich at a time.
It doesn't seem to stop people wanting more, does it?
Oh no, how many homes and cars and planes and boats? Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's a ridiculous construct to get caught into. And I'm happy to see a number of movies and shows discussing this more and more in the current culture. So that's great.
So we are now 5 minutes from the concluding session with Frank. And
thank you very
Kitika.
much. Yes.
So, anyway, I think we'll have to close the breakout room and head back to the main room. But Victor, thank you so much for such a comprehensive shining a light on all of this, and can't wait to be with you in more places. So
super. Thank you so much.
All right. See you on the other side.
See you there. Thank you all.
Before you go, can you share your email address again, or put up your last slide?
Oh, sure.
Or put it in the chat, something?
Yeah, absolutely. Here we go. There
Okay.
you go. You can find me, Victor Cole, my name, at Singapore Tech, where I work. There's also my LinkedIn page. And I'd be very happy to connect with you online if you'd like to reach out to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.